Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Sorry that took us more than a minute to get everyone ready, but we are ready for you now. So without further ado, let's begin our first panel. We're so excited to have as our moderator, Pragya Tiwari. She's a prolific journalist and editor who writes on politics, policy, and culture from across the world, including for the New York Times and Al Jazeera. She is the creative director of Ojo Media and the co-founder of the Indian History Collective, which aims to bring fresh insight to build a more informed historical understanding of India. We also have three speakers joining with us today. First, we have Sonali Gyani, who is an LGBTQIA+ activist and filmmaker. She is the co-founder of the youth LGBTQ initiative Yaryan and Mumbai-based support group Umang, a safe space for lesbians, bisexual women, and transmasculine persons. We also have Urvashi Butalia, longtime activist in the women's movement in India and an independent researcher writer. She's the co-founder of India's first feminist publishing house, Gali for Women, and is currently the director of Zuban, which is a Delhi-based independent feminist publishing house. Last but not least, we have Zakia Soman, who is a petitioner and won the legal case for both the entry of women into the Haji Ali Dargah, as well as the abolishment of triple talaq. She's the co-founder of Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan and the founder of Center for Peace Studies, which is engaged in policy activism for peace and justice, religious tolerance, pluralism, and the rights of minorities. We unfortunately had an emergency for Dr. Padmashali, so I don't think she'll be able to join us today, but in case she is, she may just dial in last minute. So apologies for that disruption potentially. Without further ado, we'd like to hand it over to Pragya to get us started.
Thank you very, very much. We have some excellent speakers with us, so I'm not going to take too long to introduce the session, but I feel like it is important for me to kind of just set the context to what we're going to be discussing over the next hour or so. We are 2 days away from the Independence Day, from 15th of August, which is always a landmark day for us as a country. And as we look back, there have been changes, both in terms of substantive changes as well as changes when it comes to the discourse around gender. Some of these changes have come subtly over time, unseen, unfelt, and others have come more as big bangs in our history. There's back in the day, perhaps when Urvashi started out, and when we spoke about the women's movement, it used to be considered a sort of monolith. There was very little recognition or understanding about intersectionality, about how the same sort of issues play out differently for women, how class matters, how caste plays into it, how being from a religious minority plays into it. There was also very little, if at all, any recognition of other genders when we spoke about the gender movement. There wasn't much awareness about the LGBTQIA+ movement at all. And forget about intersectionality within that, how caste, etc., affects people from that umbrella community differently, and what sort of nuanced differences exist within the sort of sub-communities within that community. Today, these kinds of conversations are happening. One can't be optimistic enough to say that the recognition is as widespread as it should be, but at least it's on the table. We're discussing it over here. But as much as there is cause to celebrate, if you just open any newspaper on any given day, there will be reasons for despair when it comes to the way women and gender minorities in this country are treated, or the kinds of violence and injustice that they have to bear. So this session really is about trying to examine what has changed, what remains the same, what, if at all, anything has gotten worse, and what solutions, what battles do we have up ahead. And we're going to try and examine it from a historical perspective, a social perspective, a legal perspective, political representation perspective, and also from the perspective of what has changed within the workplace. I'm going to ask a couple of broad-based questions to our panelists, and then some smaller questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience and take your questions in as well. So with that out of the way, I'm going to start with you, Urvashi, and the first question is actually really common to all three of you. But Urvashi, I wanted to you to come in first and kind of give us a perspective of what you feel. You know, you've been sort of really in the ring, so to speak, when it comes to the women's movement. You've seen it play out. You've been part of that history. How do you view the changes that have come, particularly from the perspective of how the state interacts with women, and how it recognizes women, and of course gender minorities?
Okay. Thank you, Pragya, and thank you, Charcha, for having me here. I'm delighted to be with Sonal and Zakia. I'm really sorry Akka is not here, but she's pretty fantastic, and it would have been great to listen to her. So, Pragya, the question that you're asking, one can answer it in many different ways, or one can try to. I'm going to take a slightly historical approach. So, if you look at the new India post-independence, and you look at the several decades that follow, in policy planning documents such as, for example, the 5-year plans, you see a growing understanding on the part of the state of the issue of gender. And 5-year plans, for example, go from articulating women as beneficiaries of welfare to women's rights, etc., to gender by the time we get to the 12th plan. None of this happens without a push from the women's movement on the ground. So I think that's one thing. But while this is happening, there are several other things happening, I think, which impact the discourse on gender in very deep ways. And they're not happening at the level of the state. They're happening because they are being pushed by movements on the ground. The first of these is, and I'm not listing them in any specific order, I'm going to talk about three things. One is the growing caste assertion and articulation that actually gets catalyzed by the anti-Mandal movement in the 1990s. And subsequent to that, you see a lot of young Dalit Bahujan people, a lot of young women coming out and expressing their identities, showing their anger, fighting for justice, fighting for citizenship. And you see some legislation a bit later, quite a bit later, such as the Prevention of Atrocities Act, that impacts on that. So that is one thing. The second thing happens roughly around the same time, actually, but the catalyzer here is the AIDS epidemic that starts to happen in India, which brings out late 80s on the discussion on sex into the public domain, and which then leads to different expressions of sexual identity and a slew of battles for changing legislation centered mainly around 377. The back and forth until 377 finally goes away. And alongside that, the solidarities that are built up among people of different genders and those who see themselves as women, so feminists, the voices against 377, etc., and also trans identities come out into the public, and you look at the NALSA judgment, and then you look at the trans bill, which isn't a great document and which goes back on NALSA quite a bit, but nevertheless, there is a growing kind of recognition of this. And the third thing is, as I see, the articulation of anger and injustice at the way in which minorities are treated in our country, and more specifically women. And I see this historically with hindsight as starting or getting catalyzed by the Shahabano case, and then coming from there right up to the many Shaheen Baghs that we see, and the kind of activism we see in Jamia Millia with young students who take up different causes. And here again, you see an assertion of minority identity and minority gender identity centered around questions of rights, claims, citizenship. In very interesting ways in the last 40 years or last 30 years, these things have come together and they have intermeshed in ways that allow us a really fascinating, really rich discourse on gender. Because of course, if you are queer, you can't only be queer, you could be queer and Muslim, or you could be queer and Dalit. And those intersections are what make for a really, really rich and interesting discourse. at the level of people's movements. Some state actors talk about this, but by and large, as you yourself have pointed out, the newspapers and the state, when they're talking, tell a very different story. So we have a long way to go, but I think the beginning is great because what we are thinking about now in terms of gender is so different from 75 years ago and is so radical that it can upturn all the certainties of our society, which I think is a very exciting moment to be in.
Indeed, it is. I'm going to take the same question to you, Zakia, and I think some seeds were already planted in what Urvashi spoke about. But when it comes to Muslim women, their participation in the women's movement, had to be on their own terms, as well as had to represent the women's movement, had to represent for it to be really powerful and inclusive, their realities, their particular realities. And often in the history of India, Muslim women have been at this very sort of curious sort of double bind, where on the one hand they have to stand up against sort of patriarchal norms within the community, and and on the other hand they are also they've been part of a persecuted religious minority within the country. I mean, I'm not saying at all given points in times, but historically that's happened over and over again in different parts of the country. So, I'd like for you to speak a little bit about this double bind and, the changes that you've seen when it comes to Muslim women being able to be part of the larger women's empowerment movement in this country, where it stands today and where it's come from. Sorry, Zakia, you're muted. You're still muted.
Hi, Pragya, and hi, Urvashi, and hi, Sonal. I think the background context has already been provided by Urvashi. I would like to, put on board certain facts about India's largest minority. Right from the time of independence onwards, despite the constitutional guarantees and the constitutional safeguards, there has been a consistent onslaught in terms of discrimination, in terms of communalism, in terms of undermining of the citizenship rights. So there has been a silent kind of a discrimination which has been going on, which has now come to the fore with the rise of the political rise of the right. Having said that, we have to also sort of celebrate the fact that from Shah Banu to now Triple Talaq and Shaheen Bagh is a huge progress. So, both these things have happened side by side. And I think a lot of churning has happened in the last couple of decades, particularly post 9/11. And immediately after 9/11 in 2002, there were massive riots in Gujarat. So that has also, in my personal experience, that has led to a huge churning within the Muslim community. A lot of young women and some young men have come forward. They've become socially conscious. They've been made conscious about their second-class status, but at the same time, they have gathered the courage to assert their rights and their equal citizenship as was being told by Urvashi. So I think we are in a very interesting kind of a backdrop, because as far as the Muslim women are concerned, the exclusion is inside the home, in family, in community, and in the larger society and in polity. So there is an onslaught from the state. There's an onslaught from the communal elements, and there is kind of lack of recognition of equal rights given to her by the religion and by the Quran, in the absence of a codified Muslim family law, or in the absence of any kind of reform in the Muslim personal law. See, unlike our Hindu sisters and our sisters from the Christian community, who have had I'm not saying that patriarchy is over for them and then they will become equal. No, not at all, far from it. But at least in the matter of marriage, divorce, custody and guardianship of children, property share and inheritance, they have laws passed by the Indian Parliament which stand by them. Whereas in the case of Muslim women, although there are so many affirmative practices such as meher, such as consent, such as sharing property, parental property as well as husband property, such as a just and fair divorce, which is a very laudable principle of jurisprudence. Who would have thought that it existed basically in our religion? But thanks to the kind of popular perception, owing to the behavior of people like the personal men in the personal law board and other religious conservative men who have become somehow the sole custodians and sole spokespersons of the community. So thanks to them, I don't think most Indians thought that there was any chance for equality for women in Islam. So that is what has been the contribution of the Muslim women. They have stood up and they have informed the whole country and the whole world that gender justice is a fundamental principle of Islam, and we want to sort of assert that. At the same time, equally vociferously, they have stood up for their constitutional rights, and they have also demanded equal citizenship. The entire opposition to the Citizenship Amendment Act, which is a act which is discriminatory. It divides Indians on the basis of religion. It violates all the principles of our constitution, and it is so heartening that the opposition has come from young women and even dadis of Shaheen Bagh, who have led the entire struggle. So it is a huge change. But I would also say that the onslaught of the communal forces, particularly the forces which now enjoy a lot of power in our country, have sort of made this discrimination, which was always there, but there was a lip sympathy to the minorities' rights. There was a lip sympathy in the politics of Congress. If we see, there was a lip sympathy for secularism. There was, at least there was discussion about, minorities not getting their due, things like that. They constituted earlier. Indira Gandhi constituted the Gopal Singh Committee to understand the socio-economic conditions of the minority, and then later on Manmohan Singh constituted this committee, such a committee to understand the situation and alleviate it. But now it is, I'm sorry to say, but with the kind of laws which are being brought about in the name of fighting, ostensibly the whole bogey of love jihad, and the kind of laws which are being brought about, and of course the CAA and the looming threat of NRC, it is almost becoming like a formal and legal kind of exclusion of the minorities, which is going to be a huge challenge in the coming days. And that will make the quest for gender justice and gender equality for Muslim women and Dalit women, and of course all women of India, that much more difficult. Because if we look at who are the people and the organizations who sort of comprise the right, they are also extremely patriarchal in their views. And we have seen numerous kind of debates in the media about elected representatives, even chief ministers, talking about why a girl cannot wear a jeans, why she should not be allowed to use the mobile, so it's like the challenge in front of the women's rights community and the feminist community and the entire democratic community of our country. It has got magnified because of the kind of power that these forces have come to enjoy. And also there has been although I'm not saying that communal riots in our country have been a regular occurrence ever since independence, even if we don't go before that. But the kind of vitiated climate that we are seeing today, the kind of hate we are seeing today, the kind of otherization and demonization of quote unquote the Muslim is becoming very toxic and vicious, and it is threatening the social fabric of our society. I would even say it is not an exaggeration to say that it is threatening the unity and integrity of our country. So that is another major challenge. But I also find a lot of hope in the young women and young men within the community who have who are everywhere across different states, who are working on the ground, and principles of engagement are the principles enshrined in the Constitution of India. So that is what, something that gives me a lot of hope. So I think, yeah, at this stage, Pragya, I hope I have done some justice to the kind of questions that you were raising.
Absolutely, Zakir. That's very well put. Thank you, Sonal. I want to come to you, take the same question to you. Recognition of the LGBTQIA plus movement on the one hand, and then recognition of the sort of nuances of issues within that sort of umbrella. If you could just give us a little bit of a historical perspective. I'm sure you will talk a little bit about 377, but what tends to happen is that, as huge a moment as 377, the 377 judgment was, there is history before that, there's progress before that, and there's a lot that's happening, that continues to happen, behind the scenes after that. So if you could just give us an overall perspective, that'd be great.
Thanks, Pragya. Thanks for having me here, and thank you, Urvashi and Zakia. Just adding on to what they've already said, of course, it's important to speak about Section 377 because, in some sense, the court case around Section 377 has galvanized a lot of conversation around the community itself. So, for those who are not aware of it, this is Section 377 is a part of the Indian Penal Code, which came into effect during 1861. From 1861, it's been on in India. So what we find is that it's a British code which was codified in 1861. From there, that's where it's coming in. But what it essentially does is it criminalizes any sexual behavior which is not procreative. And actually, for a lot of people who are unaware, it includes people who are heterosexual as well, who are having sex which will not lead to childbirth. However, this law has been used against the community quite disproportionately, and what we find is that if even because of this law, uh, the community was very much blackmailed and threatened by different social elements, whether it was anti-social elements, whether they were gangs, or even sometimes with police officials. That's what's been reported on the ground. And the actually the HIV/AIDS movement is the one which made was the reason that this case had to be sort of fought, because what we were finding is that once the HIV/AIDS epidemic hit the country, the community was disproportionately affected, and we saw a change in the queer movement also because of the way NGOs were formed to tackle the epidemic. So we saw a kind of growing of communities which are supported. Otherwise, initially, for I think before your 1990s, you had communities, not like the communities did not exist. There were communities, but these were not like registered bodies, or mainly they were not visible in the public eye. There are many examples of collectives in the 1960s, 1970s, and what we see in 1970s, 80s is that there were a lot of publications and hidden magazines actually across India, which were sort of operating, through which people were connecting. And some of these some of the people who were running these magazines, after interacting with people and the kind of communication they were receiving, they have created support groups which are hidden. But what we see is that uh, the collectives did not sustain. They went on for a few years, but they didn't really sustain. If you had to look at collectives which have sustained for 20-30 years, it's really a handful. But in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, what we were seeing is that in some sense, when you talked about the community, it was sort of together. But post the HIV epidemic and the way the NGOization has happened, we see that there was a sort of fracture actually between gay men and the women's rights movement. That's something that we sort of see moving on from there. And of course, this the debate of Section 377, it had to be challenged because it was coming in the way of any kind of outreach work. Because outreach workers were being harassed by police officials, and that's how this case came into in 19 we see the NAS Foundation in 2009. We find that the NAS Foundation, when they had challenged the case, the Delhi High Court came out with a judgment where it was saying that it found that private and adult consensual non-commercial sex is not it's not in non-consensual, sorry, if it is private, it's adult and consensual, it's not against the fundamental rights and not against the Indian Constitution. So this Section 377 was removed. But essentially what happened because of that, during this period, we find that there was a lot of conversation and a lot of debate. And from the 2000s, actually, we see, at least the experience has been that the queer community started also coming out. Up till then, you had a few interviews of queer persons, giving interviews to certain magazines, but the collectives were very much hidden. But I think from 2009, 2010, you will start seeing that very much the collective started occupying public space and being very visible and very open, and that has sort of continued. This judgment, of course, was reversed in 2013, and then again the verdict in support of removing Section 377 happened in 2018. And I think this period in the middle, what we have seen is that we also had a very important verdict, which was the NALSA, known as the NALSA verdict, which was looking at recognizing, transgender rights. And besides this, we've also had a lot of, court cases happening looking for rights of intersex persons. And, again, during this time, we've seen some disconnect with the transgender communities and the gay communities. As far as the lesbian bisexual communities are concerned, they are still pretty hidden. And while it is 2021 now, we don't have enough representation of lesbian women in the mainstream as in comparison to, say, gay men or people of trans identities. It still continues to be a challenge, and these groups are still pretty hidden, and they are still a handful. To just give you a comparison, if I talk about these NGOs which are working on HIV rights, there are more than 100 organizations working, calling themselves community-based organizations. But if we just sat down to, think of, say, organizations registered working with as an NGO, working for lesbian and bisexual women's rights, it's difficult to even count 10. So that is the kind of, difference that you are sort of seeing. And of course, we had this protection of trans rights bill being passed in 2019, which while some parts of the bill are pretty useful to the community, but largely it's problematic because what we find is that not enough communication has happened with the trans communities, and the changes that we wanted have not really been reflected sort of in the bill. Which also brings me to this bit of it, that now what one is seeing is that there is an emergence of persons of identities which are not necessarily LGBT, IQ or Hijra identities. We have like a new wave coming where you have new identities where persons are identifying under the non-binary umbrella. So you have people identifying as genderqueer. Within the sexuality also, you will find people identify as demisexual, as polyamorous. And you will find that there is a lot of challenging happening in terms of just the way, even just the word, transgender is being represented in popular media. From my work in Umang, I can tell you this much, that one of the bigger challenges still happens to be that, in popular public perception, when you say transgender person, people automatically only think of hijras. And in many conversations, trans masculine persons sort of get left out. Case in point being like the Maharashtra Transgender Welfare Board. Like initially when it was announced, it had no representation from the trans masculine community at all. And this is something that we have to sort of continuously fight, that, that there are policies that are made, but they don't include people who are other than from the Hijra community. And so that's why I feel like there's a sort of fracture within that as well. A good thing that's been happening is that we've been, there has been a questioning happening in terms of how intersectional the queer movement really is, especially when it comes to, caste and class and your privilege location, which has been I think something which was much needed but has been coming in very, very late, right? And we do find that right now, currently, when we look at the community, while the activists which are who are working towards LGBTQIA plus rights may more or less be, of similar opinion. What we find is the community is fractured. We do find that religious ideology has become a part of major part of fraction between the two communities. Uh, Again, we find that very much the discourse around LGBTQ rights seems to be the visibility around LGBTQ rights is mostly centered around rights of gay men, gay cis men. So what you are finding again is that we have the marriage rights. We are fighting for our marriage rights, and this is what is getting the publicity. But if you sort of talk to the community in whole, what you would find is that a lot of people do not want to support the marriage rights. But I think that voice is hardly getting reflected. Challenging, the problematic aspects of the transgender rights bill has not really happened. What we want is still now, conversion therapy is not banned in India. We don't have a law which clearly prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexuality, especially during employment outside of spaces which are state or center. So I think these are things that we have to sort of really work on.
This I'm sorry, I'll come back to later because I'm hoping you'll be able to give us a little bit more substance on what you feel are the battles that are at hand immediately. So I will come back to this later. Thank you for that. That was a wonderful. I mean, this is a very complex question and within very limited time, but I think you've given us a fantastic perspective. I just want to come back to you, Urvashi, with one or two quick questions. One is something that Zakia, we in the first part of our chat we talked about how much progress there's been and what have been sort of these key moments in time, flashpoints that have helped the movement become richer, more nuanced, more intersectional, etc. But I just also kind of want to have a conversation about something that Zakia brought up, which is laws such as love jihad. When you have a particular moment in history that we are in this moment, we always feel that there is one other, but very quickly that starts to, the lines between who's the other and who's not start to blur. And if you look at really what the love jihad laws are, ostensibly, obviously they might be targeting minority men, but or Muslim men, but they also kind of really take away agency, infantilize women, particularly Hindu women, or irrespective of caste and class. So that's just something that is very, very disturbing. And of course, patriarchal statements from people who are in power, etc. I was wondering if we could. I want to get your perspective on what this friction really means for the future of the movement. I mean, on the one hand, we've had some progressive legislation, women are out there, speaking for themselves, etc., claiming their space. And then you have a state which is kind of official, making a lot of these regressive things official. Do you think this is taking the movement back? One. Two, something that Sonal brought up. We are at a time when sort of there is a lot of political polarization in the country. And it's almost becoming overpowering in terms of how we identify ourselves, right? That's the first thing that's coming up in many ways. Is there a chance that a solidarity that has, one can't say that there is as much solidarity as there should be, but, a hard-won solidarity within the broader gender movement could get fractured because of this political factionalism?
Actually, Pragya, there's always a chance, to start with your last question first, that the solidarities built in political movements will get fractured or will be broken by the powers that be, and that the tactics used to break them are often tactics that people who are involved in the movements, people like us who might be, part of different protests, don't necessarily recognize or are not trained to deal with. So that danger is always there. So I think on the one hand, we have that. On the other hand, your first question, my sense is that progress or change is not ever a linear process. It is always a process of, two steps forward, one step back, or the other way around. And when it is actually complicated, when our solidarities, so the two questions are really connected, when our solidarities are complicated by internal differences between us. What Sonal is talking about, the many fractures within the broad LGBTQIA community, what Zakia is talking about, because even within the Muslim community, Muslim women are not a homogeneous group, and there are very many differences in, some groups will want to go according to the constitution, some will be wanting to go according to Islam. There are many of those differences. So we are vulnerable because of these differences, but we are also, I think, rich because of these differences. Because if we are able to talk across those differences and if we are able to dialogue among ourselves, that too is progress, that too is change, and we learn so much. We learn so much about why these identities are so important to people, and they may seem to be fracturing on the one hand, but they are also offering possibilities of building solidarities on the other. So I think that we need to not be complacent because we are up against very, very strong forces right now. And for the first time, we're up against more or less state sanction for the kind of hate speech violence. And you're quite right, the infantilizing of women that the love jihad law brings in, of Hindu women. And of course, the infantilizing of Muslim women has been going on before this law even came in. As we know from the Hadia case, where a 24-year-old woman is not allowed to marry the man of her choice and is seen as, her marriage should be the responsibility of her father. I mean, it's a load of nonsense in a country that subscribes to a constitution that talks about equality. So it's not as if these challenges haven't been there. They always have. And they have thrown up particular questions for movements like ours. For example, do you collaborate with the state? Do you collaborate with the state that you know to be right-wing? But if that state is bringing in a law, what is your responsibility? Should you work on that law? And the important thing is to rise to these challenges and find a way of dealing with them and not to fall into despair, because look at it the other way. I mean, look at what happened with the anti-CAA movements. Who would have thought, that women would have come out like that? I'll tell you just a tiny story. I don't want to take up too much time. There's a young woman who works in my house as a domestic worker. She's a Boro from Assam, and she was recruited by the several recruiters who go out seeking either sex workers or domestic workers, etc., and who bring them to cities to work in families. She's illiterate. Her parents educated the boys, didn't educate her. She comes from dire poverty, etc. She's made her life in the last 20 years. She's learned how to drive a car. She married a man she loved to a different community. The parents allowed it. Together, they bought a piece of land on which they built a house. And then came the Supreme Court order, this Koregaon near Faridabad near Delhi, to raise that land because it's in the foothills of the Aravalis. Obviously, it was sold to them by some crook. And she's in despair, 20 years of hard work. But the one positive thing, she's so angry that all the serials she used to watch on her phone while cooking have been abandoned, and she's listening to political speeches. And to me, okay, huge problems, but look at the courage. That's really what we need to focus on.
Thank you, Urvashi. I want to take a similar question to you, Zakia. We were talking about, you mentioned this earlier. There was a lot of debate around the triple talaq bill, right? Now, somewhat, I'm not making direct comparison, but somewhat like the trans bill. It was something that can be seen as progressive and needed, but, did it go too far? Was it compromised in some way because of how it was being passed, etc.? These questions sort of hung in the air. And I remember way before this government, in fact, came into power, you and me having a conversation about how, you were somebody who believed very from the very start that the solutions to patriarchal issues rooted in, sort of religious patriarchy that Muslim women face should come from Muslim women. They don't need to be saved by anybody, by liberals or by, the government or whoever the powers be. In that light, Zakia, I would like you to talk a little bit about the Triple Talaq bill. And of course, you also mentioned the need for a codified Muslim law. I mean, if that was ever to come into place, or UCC was to come into place, again, I would really like to hear your perspective and what's the ideal way forward for changes like that to come through. Also, a secondary question, but actually, I'll keep it for later. This is broad enough. If you can cover this to start with.
Yeah, so like you rightly said, Pragya, it led to a lot of upheaval, the Triple Talaq bill, and of course we were not happy with what was brought, and we immediately suggested amendments. But how it went, because why just the Triple Talaq law? This government doesn't listen to anybody on any law. It doesn't listen to the farmers. It doesn't listen to the students. Doesn't listen to academics, experts. Nobody. So we have seen it in COVID time also. So yeah. But the thing is that I would like to make it bold and say it here that we need, we who are the progressives, or we who are into social activism, we also need to sometimes reflect inward and look at what are our professed values, and what is our practice, and what is our behavior. I think that concern also needs to be brought in here, because it's very easy for people who have never worked in the first place for abolition of Triple Talaq to throw out the baby with the bathwater, and that's what a lot of them ended up doing. So my problem here, there are several problems here, but my fundamental problem here is that when the woman is fighting patriarchy and injustice meted out to her by her husband or by her family, she is fighting alone. But when it comes to, she sort of reaching some kind of a solution, and it's not an ideal solution, like I said, it's, far from it, then everybody stands up. See, a lot of people, and true that there is a lot which has to be opposed. Like I think you were saying that if the government is bringing about some policy or some law which is slightly good also, shouldn't we support it, or should we support it, or should we not support it? So that I think requires a greater discussion, because there has been also instrumentalization of because some people are just interested in opposing. And I'm not saying that there is a lot to oppose, and in particularly in this government there is a lot to oppose. But it all got mixed up. Also, I'm very clear about that. But at the same time, it has been a gain in the sense that there has been a huge understanding and awakening and realization within the Muslim community that instant triple talaq is not sanctioned by the Quran. And that has led to huge coming down. The incidence going down has a lot to do with that. That is one. And then look at it. On the other hand, they announced this law. But today also, if a woman suffers from triple talaq and she wants to go and register an FIR, nobody is there to register it for her. So that says everything. But I feel that it's easy to sort of point out the political enemy and criticize them with very incisive kind of whatever understanding. But that same should apply to us also, I feel, because there are all kinds of people who call themselves activists or champions of these rights or those rights, and generally some of them don't like when some new people come up. People like, they're saying that we are doing this for 40 years and these women have just come from where have they come, and they are everywhere. It's not our fault. if there is a right-wing government, and because of that government's signal from that government, if the media really took up the issue of triple talaq, we are happy. We are happy that it gave voice to the very, very marginalized sections, namely the Muslim women, especially those who are coming from the lower socioeconomic background, and they have been suffering, and they have been kept into that suffering by their own community leaders also. So it was a good development. But it's so Pragya, so those kind of things are also there. And as far as the law is concerned, most laws when they come in our country are not perfect. But having said that, the demand for reform in Muslim personal law predates the BJP government at the center. And all these people who now really vociferously stood up to oppose the triple talaq bill were not anywhere, seen to be demanding Muslim women's rights or reform in the personal law before 2014. So I'm also talking about the legitimacy. So if I hear the women themselves, my God, it's unbelievable. Unbelievable. She says कि उसने मेरी पूरी जिंदगी बर्बाद कर दी और आप उसको बचाने, like, our initial reaction also was we didn't accept the bill. We first, did very emergency kind of small community meetings, and this was the reaction we got from the women. Then we had to tell them, no, an eye for an eye cannot be the way forward. But it was very, very, revealing for us also. वो बोल रही है कि उसने मेरी पूरी जिंदगी बर्बाद कर दी, आप उसको बचाने में पड़े हुए जब अब कानून आ रहा है. Of course, now she is also realizing that वो कानून, it has not sort of led to her well-being. It's fine. But once there is a legal mechanism in place, we can hope in the coming years, in the coming decades, we will ask for amendments, we will ask for changes, and one day it will materialize. Pragya, I don't know. I'm being very hopeful, but yeah.
Thank you for that, Zakia. Very quickly.
I'm sorry about this. I said this kind of things. So.
No, please, no. This was really good. Thank you very much, Sonal. Quick question, and then I'll ask all of you a common question in terms of what battles lie ahead and what you think needs to change. But Sonal, before I do that, I just wanted to kind of get a sense of, you mentioned something when you were giving us that sort of overview, which is that there are new identities coming up, and there's now a recognition of non-binary persons, etc., new identities, and one of the things that we've been seeing a lot of is, people declaring their pronouns, for example, on social media, whether they are cis men or, mostly it's women, but even cis men doing that. Now, this is symbolic, this is small. Is it important? Is it something that has sort of the potential to make a lasting change when it comes to the discourse? And the second part to this question is that, or do you feel like it might be kind of an elite phenomena that does not quite trickle down as much as it should? As it was with, even perhaps you can argue with the in the beginning of the LGBTQIA plus movement, it was only certain empowered gay men who could come out openly and say that they are gay, or not even openly, but at least they were okay with being recognized as queer. But obviously the repercussions were not the same for other people. I would, sorry, before I give the mic to you, I really want to applaud Zakia for bringing up the rule of law question, because, we often talk about social change, but we keep forgetting that the one thing that threads all of this is, how our criminal justice system really operates. So we can have the best laws in place and the best discourse in place, but in the end, it boils down to the police and the court and the judiciary. And I think that's a common thread that kind of runs through the gender movement, no matter where you come at it from. But yeah, sorry for that digression. So over to you.
I think 100% the pronoun conversation is making a difference. Simply because language is a form of gender expression. What you speak is how you express yourself. And if your own language sort of doesn't even present you, so then you are automatically invisibilized. And if you see that, if you look at the usage of at least the pronoun they, it is inviting people to challenge the binariness within the English language. Okay, so automatically when we even started the pronoun conversation, we are forcing you to think differently, because language shapes thoughts, thought shape behavior, and behavior shape the culture eventually. And it's really a simple thing like pronoun, and it's very, very important that people are doing it these days, because something as simple as just an introduction with a pronoun allows the recognition of different kind of communities within a space. So just as an example, if we look at 61 people in this room currently, if we don't ask for pronouns, unfortunately the unconscious assumption is everybody's cis and we are going to speak to them like that. We will not include different communities. So the pronoun conversation becomes very important. I think where it sort of becomes a bit elite is when we don't ground ourselves in why the pronoun conversation is happening. Sometimes I've seen this, especially within workspace inclusion dialogues, that people are forcing their staff to sort of use the pronouns, but not really explaining why or where. So sure, it sort of starts it, but I think that sometimes it's important to also give some background as to why that is sort of happening. I think that this whole discourse around pronouns, it seems a bit elitist to me, because we are not really talking much about how different languages have actually made a room for inclusion of different minorities. And there have been some great examples within different cultures which do include. But I think it's largely restricted to this particular language. But however, having said that, I will say that it's currently without the pronouns we are invisibilizing completely. So it is one step in that direction, but it needs to be followed up with more serious work in terms of really including gender minorities within societies and workspaces and even the law. So something as basic as the NALSA judgment should have come much earlier. It has started this conversation, however. So it ties in, everything ties in together.
So very quickly, just a minute each. We are almost out of time, and I want to start taking in audience questions. But before I do, just a minute each, starting with you, Urvashi. What are the immediate battles that you see at hand? What do you think? I mean, at any given point in time, there are hundreds of battles. But if we had to pick battles, if you had to pick battles at this point in time, what sounds most urgent to you?
I think it's very difficult to say, Pragya, what are the immediate battles, because as you say, there are so many of them. And both Sonal and Zakia have spoken about two specific battles. There could be hundreds of them. So I think that all I could say is, and about pronouns, I want to say we think that they're English and they're elitist. We think they are, but I'm not sure they are. I used to have a Hijra friend called Mona Ahmed. And Mona I knew as a woman, and her nephew lived with her. He knew her as his uncle. And sometimes we would have a conversation where the three of us would be talking, and I would be referring to Mona as she, and Nasir would be referring to her as he, because he was her his mamu. And Mona would be referring to herself as they, but in Hindi. मैं ऐसे करते हैं, मैं वहाँ जाते हैं. Turned the language around to fit her. And I thought that was so brilliant that I was really inspired by that. So really, but quickly to answer your question, I think that all we can do is that in our separate fields where we work, we try to make the change that we are seeking, and we listen to the voices on the ground. I know all this sounds very generic, but like I'm a publisher and a writer, for me, it's very, very important to reflect the kind of debates we've been talking about over there. But it's also very important that if, for example, I am publishing something that Zakia has written, it should not only be Zakia's voice, but also the voices of all those women who talked to her and said कि वो सारी उम्र हमें मारता है, तो आप उसको कोई कुछ किया जा रहा है तो तुम क्यों रोक रही हो? So I think we can only do that in our own fields. We can try to do the best we can and recognize what is happening, which is also so important. There's so many places where people are managing to make a difference.
Zakia?
So there are many challenges, no doubt, and many things to be done. But the immediate challenge, I think, is to keep our sanity and to keep our voices intact. Looking at the kind of political onslaught which is there, not just on women, but on, I feel, the entire society and the entire community. And how to get more and more people to sort of see our viewpoint, that is very, very important. I also feel that sometimes the challenge is political, and it has to be fought politically by the political parties. But the civil society and the social movements and the struggle groups have a lot of role to play. They should be the one who should be sort of keep setting the agenda and keeping all the political forces accountable to the constitutional values. So I think that should be the way forward. But how that can be done, I'm yeah, I also don't have, nobody has answers on that, but I feel that's the way to go. Yeah, Pragya, from my side.
Thank you. Sonal?
I mean, I would say that in terms of the queer movement, I think it's just really important to address the polarity that's happening, and very seriously work on intersectionality. The second thing I would say is very important to look at healthcare, and especially around conversion therapy, and what kind of problematic surgeries are happening when it comes to gender affirmation surgeries, especially because trans lives matter, and we are not talking enough about what kind of botched up surgeries are happening around India, and completely we cannot hold any of the medical fraternity accountable, without certain laws in place. So follow that up with the third one, which I think is important, is to look at discrimination, banning discrimination legislatively. We have to fight for that. Those are the top three things I would say.
Thank you. I'm going to take the first audience question, which is from Humanity Foundation of India. How do we assess if a workplace is gender inclusive? Are there any parameters or a framework? This can be, taken by any one of you, but I would like you to weigh in at some point, Sonal, for sure, because I work with, we work with, my company works with corporates, and D&I conversation today seems entirely almost focused on women. I mean, that's a huge battle. I'm not saying it's not, but nobody even wants to touch caste and LGBTQIA yet. Not nobody, but very few corporates are even willing to have that conversation. But I'd like to start with you, Urvashi, if you have any thoughts, Zakia and Sonal.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. We've been struggling with this for a long time in trying to create an inclusive workplace. And we found that the challenges are many. I mean, in recruitment policies, obviously. And I remember recently we advertised a post and we said it was for religious minorities. And we got a lot of flack on social media saying, what the hell do you mean by doing this, and so on. So you have to stick with your guns and say that. But, it's not only that, it is also a whole range of other things. For example, for us in the content of what we publish, because you cannot only have recruitment policies that are inclusive, nor can you have upper class editors who produce content and who produce voices, appropriate the voices of people on the margins. So you have to look at that in the ways in which you produce that content, and how you understand knowledge and where it comes from. That's really what we are about, because the knowledge has also been dominated by and large by upper class, Western educated people. So to take that extra step to go beyond, and also to really value your workers. Your workplace is made up of your workers. That distance and that opposition between the management and the worker, and that hostility that defines that relationship, that can only be changed by actually working hard to make everyone feel safe, cared for, valued, and a part of the organization. And to me, that's all a part of making a workplace inclusive. Not only looking at recruitment policies, but that's important.
Sonal, any thoughts?
I think adding to that, of course, for me, the first and foremost one is the most basic is to have an anti-discrimination policy in place. Simply because, I had this friend who said this, you don't recruit aliens, yeah? You're going to recruit people from within society as well. And if transphobia, homophobia exists there, it's going to show up in the workplace. So you need to give firefighting tools to the community, which was obviously going to face it. So that's your first most basic step. But beyond that, I think it's important to sensitize the existing employees, especially the teams that trans people may be coming into, in terms of just the infrastructure. Important to consider restrooms. Um, while we are hiring as well, I know Urvashi brought it up. It's so important to mention that when you are doing a call out, that you are you are actively asking and requesting uh, trans people to sort of apply for it. And while we are saying all of this, it's very important that if your policy is friendly, it's so important to mention it on your website, the policy as well, because a lot of queer people actually do go through it. It's if you already have an existing ERG group, that's great. But if not, look at creating a space for allyship, which will really support this community. And I think that eventually you have to look at having policies which are supportive, especially when it comes to surgeries, or when it comes to partnership benefits. And also to actively make room for this specific circumstances that trans people may have. You should not be like, okay, this is the policy says this much, I will do only this much. Sometimes new situations arise, and you need to sort of also look at that, right? So I think these are the top few that I would say.
Zakia?
So I would just add that the HR policies of organizations should necessarily include sub-policies such as diversity policy. It should definitely include the prevention of sexual harassment at workplace in practice, because if you look at the corporates, and if you look at even social organizations also, very few have any kind of an understanding, leave alone adherence to that. And it's also overall very important what kind of an organization culture you build, because you can have the laws, you can have the policies, but the organization culture, if it is toxic, if it is masculine, all the policies will stay in the files and on the wall. So yeah, so it's again like a works in progress, and an organization has to be continuously mindful and conscious of what kind of a workplace it is going to be for the people who work there.
Our next question is for you in particular, Zakia. It's from Madhurima. And she says, as you rightly said, popular perception due to conservative interpretation of Quran from a gendered perspective is questionable. How do you suggest us young women work towards highlighting these misinterpretations?
Yeah, so the thing is that we have to not allow religion to be the preserve and the authority of the males. That is the fundamental proposition. So if we are religious, then we need to read our religious texts, and we need to understand them, and we need to interpret them, in the light of gender justice, or in the light of humanity and love and compassion. So that's a ongoing kind of a thing. But as far as we are concerned, we regularly organize these kind of workshops, training programs for women and men, and even girls and boys, where we simplify the teachings of the Quran, and we also link it to the daily lives, and also to the constitutional principles, and we make it legible for the lay person, whose life is regulated and affected by misinterpretations and distortions, or in the name of religion. So yeah, so it's an ongoing process, but there is need to question the authority of the conservative men, and take matters in our own hand, because Allah has created everybody equal, right?
So final question, I think this is the last one we'll be able to take again for all three of you. This is from Anahita, and she asks, what have been some key moments where we came close to improving gender equality but lost the battle? I would encourage all of you to interpret this as widely as possible. One thing that we haven't managed to really talk about is political representation of women. So if there's anything you want to say to that effect, or however you want to answer this question, I'll start with you, Urvashi.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think what have been some key moments, one key moment in our history was definitely what Pragya is talking about, which is in the early 90s, 1992 or thereabouts, the 73rd and 74th Amendments to our Constitution, which brought in reservation at village and municipal level elections, 33% for women, and which today has grown to about 45%. So of the 3 million elected posts that there are in India, 1.45 million are held by women. And we have not lost this battle. There have been doubts about some women being proxies for their husbands, etc., and that always happens. But in this battle, really all reports have been truly excellent of the gains that women have made and how they've learned to use political power and so on, and of the small changes that they have made. And this is what gives our people in parliament so much fear about what will happen when women enter parliament. So the opposition to that has only grown. While this to me, this is one really important moment in our history. I'll leave it to the others to come up with others.
Zakia, would you like to go next?
Yeah. So I think the arrival of internet in India has been a huge liberating force, and it has been a huge liberating force also for women and girls. And also, I consider the what happened in the Delhi rape, which goes by the name Nirbhaya rape case, a key moment, because there was an explosion of understanding, of sensitization in the lifetime of so many young Indians. Although there has been a lot of empowerment because of internet, because of technology, there is also a backlash. So yeah, so it's an opportunity missed out, and that backlash is equally strong and equally ghastly. And that backlash is now getting stronger because of the rise of the right. So I think that's the greatest evil that we need to watch out against and guard against, according to me.
Sonal?
I think there have been many moments, but I think what comes to my mind immediately is definitely the way the trans rights, protection of trans rights bill was passed. It was, it came into the parliament many times in different versions. There were multiple opportunities to, take into account the feedback from the trans community. That did not happen. So I think that was a huge opportunity lost, and there were multiple points where it could have been incorporated. The second thing I think is the Indian Psychiatric Association coming out with their position where they don't consider, homosexuality as deviant. And I think jumping on that, we should have pushed for banning conversion therapy in some way. And I think that's not happened. And in general, medical practices that are harmful, we've not really been able to challenge it, except I see the intersex movement sort of doing that. But not, I think overall, I think we have just not done enough for trans rights. We could have done much more. And other than this, so there have been multiple moments where different representatives have, tried to bring bills into the parliament to support the community, but they have not even been introduced into parliament. So I think that's been pretty shameful. We are seeing people coming into politics, especially from the trans community. Enough is not. I mean, we need to see more lesbian women, I think, or bisexual women coming into politics in that kind of way. So I think more needs to be definitely done when it comes to this intersection of gender and sexuality. And it should be a given, but it has not happened, and that says something.
I think we have. I think we have a couple of minutes, and I think it's an important question, so I'll take it. It's from Sarthak. How have different genders been impacted by COVID-19 and lockdowns in specific? I'll start with you, Sonal, because I know you wanted to talk about this, and then go to Zakia and Urvashi for closing comments.
I think very badly affected. I think the more from what our reports were and the cases that we sort of handled, I mean, immediate effect on the trans women communities and the Hijra communities, where there was clearly, you couldn't even access food and water. And even while we sort of did provide them ration, it was difficult because, things like they didn't have a gas connection or the gas got over, trying to, figure that out for them. So it was literally came down to, the basic necessities. When it comes to generally other non-binary identities, a lot of them lost their jobs. so they had to go back home. And they faced a lot of familial violence because a lot of the parents were not comfortable. They wanted them to conform to the, the what they are seeing, the body they are seeing. So there was a lot of violence happening, I think, in terms of that. One also found that a lot of people felt a very, very strong urge to sort of come out, because your gender and sexuality is with you all the time, and you are locked in with your family. There's only so much you can do, and you can't reach out to your community members who were otherwise support systems, right? So we saw a lot of cases where people came out, and that also sort of led to violence, and it was quite difficult to reach out to them. Other big challenge was medication. So a lot of the trans masculine persons which were attached to our group, the hormones were not considered essential medication, and a lot of them had to sort of go back home. So it was quite difficult because they are in the middle of, say, a gender transition, and their periods would start, right? So there was so much gender dysphoria. Overall, I think that, like, you will see across the communities, mental health was a huge challenge, and it was difficult to reach out to a majority, like support in them in the way we would like to, simply because they are at home and they are cohabiting. And so how do you take these sessions, and how do you sort of explain these kind of situations? So yeah, I think that mental health and other things, but just the basic necessities for the trans communities.
Thank you, Zakia.
Yeah,
Would you
so
like to add something to that?
yeah, the COVID and the lockdown has shattered lives for many thousands of families, particularly with us, because most of the women we work with are engaged in the informal sector. Their husbands, their fathers are also in the informal sector, and at one stroke, it all ended for them. So people have had no food. So food distribution has been one of the major initiatives, which is still ongoing. And also because of the aftermath, the robbing of livelihoods continued. So it's like it's further pauperization of an already poor community. There is a tremendous mental health problems coming up from different states and different cities. There is also the media discourse around the so-called corona jihad and ill treatment. Those kind of cases have also been there in several states. It has also led to a huge vaccine hesitancy, which is even a challenge even today. So, it's from the both sides. So we want the state agencies to take the initiative to reach out to the community about the imperative that is vaccination. And we want also the community to be sort of welcoming it, and because there's no other alternative. So yeah, so overall, COVID has and lockdown has led to, has set behind the community behind by a few years actually. Yeah, so it's a huge impact.
Final thoughts, Urvashi?
Yeah, just to add to what Zakia and Sonal have said, they've basically mentioned most of the things. I think one of the things is that for trans people, and particularly for hijras and others whose professions are such public professions, of offering blessings and getting money or begging at traffic lights, etc., that whole thing completely disappeared because it was not possible for them to do that anymore. So the impoverishment and the inequality was also heightened. Many poor trans people are in sex work, and some are in sex work out of choice. There too, that entire occupation disappeared, and therefore the impoverishment was much greater. And this kind of thing obviously added to mental stress, which both of them have mentioned. And I think the one other thing would be that the being thrown back into your families and a complete loss of community in a sense, which is what gives you the possibility of feeling a sense of togetherness, of feeling being able to speak out. Maybe you recreate it on the internet, but everybody is not on the internet. So that loss, also that sense of being somehow alone, poor, powerless, I think that was very, very deep, really.
Thank you for that. That's all we have time for. I'm sorry if there were questions that we couldn't take. I tried to fit in as many as we could. Thank you, Urvashi. Thank you, Sonal. Thank you, Zakia. And thank you, all of you, for listening to us.
Thank you. Thanks, Pragya. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. What an eye-opening panel discussion to kick off our Future of Gender track. Once again, thank you so much, Zakia, Sonal, Urvashi, for such inspiring stories and insights in such a short amount of time. Also, thank you, Pragya, for probing deep and such a skilled moderation. I won't repeat because we had such a nice synthesis already, but just wanted to highlight one quote from Urvashi. You said, you know, such huge problems, but look at that courage when you were talking about the young woman. And that just really sticks with me as we move forward to the next set of conversations. All of you inspire us to have that courage to continue these discussions. So thank you so much for the incredible work you're doing. Now I just wanted to introduce you all to our second host for the rest of the day, Sirat Kaur. Sirat, if you can come on stage. Hi, Sirat. Sirat is a senior consultant at Dalberg and our global gender practice deputy. So she'll introduce us to our next session and will be your host for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Deong. Let me quickly walk you all through the next few sessions. We have next up 3 fireside chats between individuals from the same field. So we first have a conversation from 2 journalists who are from different generations, 2 lawyers who led the landmark Section 377 case, and finally 2 leaders of civil society organizations. These conversations will shed light on their personal experiences and how they have seen their industries change in terms of gender inclusivity. We will be back with the speakers in about 5 to 10 minutes, so see you all soon.